Welcome to the Great Divorce Podcast, hosted by divorce financial analyst and retirement planning counselor Andrew Hatherley. Join Andrew and guest experts as they help late-life divorcees build the financial and mental foundation for a meaningful future. There is life after divorce. Now, on to the show.
Hello. Welcome to episode 31 of the Great Divorce Podcast. Please excuse my somewhat rough voice this morning. I'm just recovering from a winter cold, but fortunately we have a guest, and hopefully she'll be doing more talking than I today. This is our last episode before Christmas 2023, so just wanted to wish all you listeners out there a very Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, or just Happy Holidays if that's your thing. Just have a great time with friends and family over the holiday season. So, should you stay or should you go? Are you uncertain whether or not you want to continue in your marriage? Well, our guest today is here to help. Linda Hershman is a licensed marriage and family therapist with nearly 30 years experience. Linda is the owner of the Couples and Family Wellness Center, a group therapy practice with offices in the Philadelphia area. She became interested in Great Divorce when she noticed how many older couples and individuals in her private practice consider or pursue divorce. Linda presents on the topics of Great Divorce, adult children of divorce, and discernment counseling, which is our topic today. That's the fancy term for essentially, should I stay or should I go? Linda is a frequent guest on podcasts and the author of Great Divorce, Everything You Need to Know About Later Life Breakups. Linda, welcome to the Great Divorce Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on, Andrew.
Very happy to have you here today. So, Linda, discernment counseling, that's a much more technical term than should I stay or should I go. Tell me a little bit more about discernment counseling, maybe the term. Do people who are wondering, should I stay or should I go, even know, are they aware of the term? And tell me a little bit more about it and how it came about.
No, they don't know about it. It's like this great widget that most people don't know somebody invented. And to give you a little bit of background on it, I did not coin the term. I did not develop the protocol. It was developed by a therapist named William Doherty, who is one of the leaders in the marriage and family therapy field today. And he did it in response to collaborating with the court system in Minnesota, where he's located. And they sent out a survey for couples who were getting divorced about if you had had another option besides divorce or marriage counseling, would you consider it? And enough people said yes that Bill went on and developed a protocol for this. I became interested because in my training, there was a big hole where I had been doing marriage counseling for a long time. When couples came in and they came in with the intention of, we each want to look at ourselves and what I need to change to make this marriage better, I looked wonderful. It almost always went really, really well. And then there were couples who came in and it just was not going to work out. But where the gap was, were for the couples where they would come in and I would have this sense that one person didn't have skin in the game. They just didn't really want to be in marriage counseling. And when you have somebody who comes in and they don't even know if they want to be there, or they think they probably don't want to be there, there's no motivation. I can't lean on them for any change. And so when Bill came out with this protocol and introduced a training, I jumped right on it. And another reason it has been very helpful is in couple counseling, the work is done with both people together for the most part. And there are things that sometimes one person is holding back and doesn't want to talk about it with their partner, because discernment counseling is not therapy and the relationship is not the patient, as it were. It gives somebody an opportunity to come in and to be honest in their discerning process about, look, I don't want my partner to know this, but, and I can work with them individually on whether this is something they want to keep or whether they want to make changes and try and work on the marriage. So discernment, getting back to your original question, is discerning whether, which of three paths you want to take. The first path is to stay the course and not make a decision at this time. And truthfully, every single person who calls me says, well, that's what we've been doing for 3 years. I'm not doing that. But they have been doing it in a passive way. In discernment counseling, I view it as a much more active stay the course. For example, I don't want to make a decision until I see this from you, or until I do a little bit of work on myself, or sometimes it can be until we're at a little bit of a different stage and then we'll revisit it. The second path is to move toward separation and divorce. And then the third path is to commit to couple counseling, to intense couple counseling, to see if the marriage can be improved. And what I tell people, because you're dealing with couples who are on the brink, you're dealing with couples who are way beyond, can this marriage be saved? And so when these couples come in and they are considering, when they say, I don't know if I want marriage counseling, I don't know if I want to save this marriage, the question I ask is, do you want to save this marriage? Which sounds very circular, but people get that.
Can I ask you a question? It seems to me that this is discernment counseling, correct me if I'm wrong, gets buy-in from people who may not be ready for marriage counseling, because you're dealing with that specific question of continuing the marriage. And marriage counseling might be a follow-on step from discernment counseling. So I'm assuming that the practice of discernment counseling is a shorter term process than marriage counseling, that it's not, that perhaps it might not be as long, as open-ended, a little bit more definitive. Am I correct in that assumption?
Oh, absolutely. Discernment counseling is brief. It's typically 1 to 5 sessions. The sessions are 2 hours long. Most of the work is done with each person individually, although there are a couple of times they are brought together, and it's mostly for each person to say, this is where I am in my decision-making process right now. Once a decision is made, discernment counseling is finished. We don't like to go beyond 5 sessions, because at that point, they're not really discerning. They're just continuing to not make decisions. But in discernment counseling, you're not working on the relationship. You are not getting communication skills. You are not getting homework assignments. You're not working together in the room for most of it. And typically we have one partner who is leaning toward divorce, the other is leaning in and wants to save the marriage. And the work with the leaning out partner is to look at the different options in ways that hopefully they have not thought about it before, and also to ask them to look at their part in how did the relationship get to the point where you're ready to walk out of this. Most of the work with the leaning in partner is on holding on to themselves throughout the discernment process to learn how to show up as their best selves, not distance and not pursue.
Right, because you might have one partner who's fairly committed to the divorce, as you say. So there's got to be buy-in. There's different types of buy-in. There's the type buy-in for the one person who may be further along the divorce lane than the other, and then there's the other who may have checked out emotionally, who's not interested in counseling per se, but may be more interested in a process that has time restraints and a definitive question to it.
Right. Well, usually in discernment counseling, we have what are called mixed agenda couples, where one person very much wants to save the marriage, the other very much is more leaning out of the marriage. And I'm sure I get a lot of referrals from family law attorneys and mediators for discernment counseling. And the reason they send those couples to me is because when the couples come in to them, typically there's one person who's very sad and doesn't want to see the marriage end, and the other one is saying, well, I just don't have the energy or the motivation for marriage counseling, so I guess I have to get a divorce.
So
And
with these,
so
I'm sorry, continue.
and so an attorney who's aware of discernment counseling will hear that and say, what if before you move forward with filing for divorce, there is a process for you that's short term, it's not marriage counseling, but it will help you make a decision with clarity and confidence. And attorneys really like this process because if the leaning out person or the couple does decide to move forward with divorce, you have a more committed couple. They're committed to the divorce process. And hopefully, if somebody goes through the discernment process and says, you know what, I think I will try marriage counseling, you will have the relief that you're not pulling a trigger for them before they've taken the final step.
That's fascinating because, I'm wondering, going through my head, wondering, who are the best candidates for discernment counseling. And, I come across couples where you can tell there's some ambivalence there. And
Mhm.
and this is a good option other than full-blown marriage counseling to get them to face some of these questions as to whether they really want to go forward with the divorce process, because unfortunately, divorce in this country can sometimes be a bit of a runaway train. And then someone will hire an attorney, and then things will escalate, and then relationships between the couple may deteriorate. And depending on the nature of the attorneys involved, it may get worse along the line. I mean, I'm glad to hear that you have very forward-thinking attorneys you work with who recognize that perhaps a step back should be taken, and someone such as yourself engaged in discernment counseling to see whether we really should move forward. So would you say that those that most likely should consider discernment counseling are those who may not be 100% sure of whether they want to get divorced? And are there cases where there are couples that are pretty sure? I mean, would it be for them at all?
Yeah, if there's any question, even if it's a 1% question, then I would say go to discernment counseling before you make a final decision on this, because like you said, divorce can be a runaway train. And once you get on that train, it's very hard to get off if you have any questions. And at least you're making a very short-term investment to ensure that you're making your decision with confidence.
That's great. You know, obviously this is the Gray Divorce podcast, and I'm curious, you've written a book about gray divorce. I'm curious how the situation of gray divorcees may relate to discernment counseling, and whether you see any unique situations with them as opposed to younger couples in the questions they may have, or situations they may have when they come to you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And to answer it, I actually would like to address kind of two stages of gray divorce. And as listeners to your podcast know, the actual definition of gray divorce is divorce over age 50. And when we're talking about couples in their 50s and maybe in their early 60s, a lot of these couples still have children who are just launching. And I will save you the pop quiz and tell you that the worst time for parents to divorce is when kids are getting ready to leave for college. And all too often, I'm sure you hear this, I hear this all the time, people coming in and saying, I don't really want to be in this marriage anymore, but until my kids leave for college,
Right.
we need to stay together. We can get into all the reasons why that is a terrible, terrible idea. I don't know how deep you want to get into it, but I will just sum it up as when children leave for college, especially if they're going away to school, it is their time to be on their own for the first time, to develop relationships outside of their neighborhood, their school system, the environment where they grew up. It is a time for them to explore their interests, to figure out who they are, and to individuate from their families. When their parents tell them we're getting a divorce, they don't have that opportunity to individuate. They have one foot in school and one foot at home. They're worrying, what's happening at home? How are my younger brothers and sisters? Where am I going to stay when I come home over Christmas vacation? And so if couples are considering divorcing and their kids are getting ready to go to school, then a discernment process would be a way to get them to look at what are the impacts on your kids if you do this right now. And do you want to take this step, or do you want to try marriage counseling? Or, it gives us a chance to ask a lot of questions that will help them make the best decisions for their kids.
Are you saying in that particular situation where you may have children on the cusp of adulthood, going off to college, that it would be better to determine one way or another whether you're going forward, rather than to be in this kind of marriage no man's land?
I would say that's not exactly what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, if you have any doubts whatsoever, know that if you take this step when your kids are getting ready to leave, that's the worst time for you to be doing it. And perhaps you want to go to discernment counseling to look at the timing and look at whether there are other options for the two of you.
But if the relationship is terrible, would it not be better to make that clean break rather than to present a profile of a dysfunctional marriage to your children?
That's more than we can get into for this. Very often, what I see though is a lot of couples who come in and they didn't have a terrible marriage. They had a good transactional marriage, but the passion might not be there. The commonalities might not be there. And they've gone through saying, well, yeah, we'll just wait till our kids are getting ready to go to college and then we can split up. But if you think about that, that has a huge emotional impact on the kids, because first of all, they start to question, was my whole life a lie? My parents looked like they were getting along fine. And what does that mean for me? They develop trust problems in their own relationships. How can I trust what I see? And they also, well, just imagine the burden on a young adult when they find out, oh, we just stayed together for you.
Right.
It's a lot of responsibility on a kid, and so on a young adult. And so again, I'm not saying stay in a terrible marriage. Hopefully, if the marriage is that terrible, you'll do something before the kids have lived a terrible marriage. But if you get to the point where your kids are getting ready to leave, if you are not 100% sure, go to discernment counseling first.
You raised a point. I'm fascinated by this because I studied history in school, and you mentioned transactional marriage. Well, isn't the history of marriage through most of humanity has been a transactional marriage? The idea of marriage for romantic love is a relatively new concept, isn't it?
Are you frozen?
No,
You're
no,
back.
I'm good. And
Oh,
so
okay.
the concept of a romantic marriage, we think that's, well, of course it's marriage, it's romantic. No, most marriages in history have been transactional marriages. And I'm wondering, getting back to the gray divorces here, perhaps you mentioned the two steps of gray divorce. I think you were going to focus also on the older gray divorcees, the
Right.
65 and up group, who are actually
Right.
driving the phenomenon of gray divorce now. They're getting divorced at a faster rate than the middle-aged divorcees. Isn't it more? Don't the transactional issues come into play in discernment counseling more for a situation where perhaps one of the partners, typically the woman, may have left her career for 20 or 30 years, where there's less time financially to recover from divorce, where there may be more obstacles based on ageism from getting back into the workplace, issues of home refinancing? Do you find that discernment counseling takes on a more transactional economic component for gray divorces, or not? I'm curious to see what your experience has been.
That certainly does factor into it more heavily, because when you're getting divorced at age 35 or 40, you have 20, 30 years to recoup your losses. And that's certainly not the case when you're 65 or 70 years old. I was laughing at myself when you said, haven't marriages been transactional through history? Because I was nodding my head and then I realized, oh yeah, we're on audio here. And yes, they were in many, many ways. They still, I mean, any relationship has transactional components. However, we have different expectations of marriage today than we did 100 years ago. And given that many women do have financial earning capacity, the transactions tend to become a lot different. So getting to the older group, the 65 plus, both men and women worry about being alone, being lonely if they get divorced later in life. Now, here's where it seems a little bit at odds, because as we know, men have a higher chance of getting into a relationship and remarrying when they're much older. And yet women initiate 66% of gray divorces.
Right.
Even though their biggest fear is, who will take care of me? But this is a big issue for older individuals or couples who are divorcing or divorce questioning. Now, of course, you don't want your spouse to be staying with you because you feel like, I'm going to need a caretaker. But it does factor into it. The economics factor into it. One of the biggest fears that men have, which again is very well founded, is, will this impact my relationship with my adult children?
Right.
And the answer to that is a hard yes in many, many cases. So these are all questions that can be looked at and talked about. But when you're talking about an older demographic, this is a group who typically has not been to marriage counseling, because it's more of a group where they were raised by parents who said, you don't air your dirty laundry in public and we don't talk about these things. And they went through and they did what had to be done, took care of what had to be taken care of, and maybe did not go to marriage counseling. And so they don't know what marriage counseling looks like. Or if they had gone to marriage counseling in the past, marriage counseling has changed very, very much, even since I've been in the field. And so, in fact, when I was in the field, licensed marriage and family therapist wasn't a thing. And now we have a license and we have very specialized training and we have much more extensive training. In the past, therapists would go into marriage counseling because they were interested and they just did it, or one of their clients brought in a partner and it went well, so they said, I can be a marriage counselor. Or they worked at an agency where they got whoever was assigned to them and it happened to be a couple, and suddenly they're marriage counselors. And so when people come to me for discernment counseling in general, but even more so with older couples, and they say, we've been to marriage counseling before, I want to know, what did that experience look like? What happened? What did you feel was useful? What did you feel was not useful? And I have a chance to educate them on, if you were to go to marriage counseling, this is what it should look like. And the other thing is, in discernment counseling, as I've mentioned, one of the big things for the leaning out partner is getting them to look at, what part did I play in the dynamics of this relationship? And if they went into marriage counseling before with the attitude of, well, my goal for you, kindly therapist, is fix that jerk over there, it's not going to work.
Right.
And so we look at, can you go in with the intention of being open to what part you play in the dynamics?
Do you find that that with older divorcing couples that they differ in which of the three paths they take more so than younger or even middle-aged versus older versus staying the course, separation, or committing to counseling? Because they have, of course, I guess you could use the word, the inertia of having maybe a longer marriage,
Mm-hmm.
and they may be more inclined to stay the course, plus the transactional economic issues we discussed. Do you find that or not, that they opt for a different path than other people?
Not at all, because if they are coming into discernment counseling, we have already had conversations where they have been told this is what you can and can't expect from this. And so they have an idea what they're getting into, and they have been informed that all options need to be on the table.
So there's no real distinct difference between the paths they take and anyone else, because they've been kind of debriefed on the process and they know what they're getting into.
Right. And that is before I see clients. I do have a conversation with each partner separately so that they understand what this is not, and make sure that I have a buy-in in the process. The other thing I wanted to say about it, Andrew, is I am a neutral in this. I don't have skin in the game as to what path they choose.
Right.
I'm there to listen to the process and to ask the questions that I haven't heard them addressing. Now, one of the things with older couples is, well, for all couples, but we'll talk about with older couples, as you know, 1 in 4 couples over age 50 divorce, but the numbers increase with each subsequent marriage.
Right.
And so if you have a couple who is coming in at age 50 or 60 or 70, and they are not taking a look at what they have brought into the marriage before they make that decision, history is likely to repeat itself.
Yeah.
And so I find it important for anybody, but older couples don't have that many more do-over opportunities.
All right. No, that's a good point. If our listeners are interested in finding a discernment counselor in their city, what's the best way of finding someone who does something like what we're discussing here?
There, on Bill Doherty's website, there is a link for Find a Discernment Counselor, and I think you can find that through discernmentcounseling.com.
Discernmentcounseling.com. Okay.
Yeah.
And what's the best way to contact you if our listeners would like to find out more about your services? And do you work remotely?
Well, I can only work in states where I have a license or a telehealth registration, which are Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Florida at the moment. But if you are interested in the book, the best place to find out where to buy the book is at lindahershman.com.
And that's Hershman, Hershman.
Yeah. And I always have a promo. If you want to buy the paperback, there's always a promo code on there for the listeners for my podcasts or my presentations. And if you have any questions for me, feel free to email me directly at lhershman, Hershman, LMFT, as in licensed marriage and family therapist, at gmail.com.
Terrific, Linda. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I think we've exposed our audience to a subject they very well may not have been aware about. And I appreciate your time very much. Thank you.
I'm always thrilled to get the opportunity to let people know there's this great widget that is all too unknown.
It is. Well, hopefully it's a little bit more well known today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of the Gray Divorce Podcast. To learn more or get in contact with your host, you can visit Andrew's website at transcendretirement.net. Also, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. That helps others find the show, and we greatly appreciate it. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
Information provided is educational only and should not be construed as legal or tax advice. Each situation is unique and should be discussed with your tax or legal advisor prior to implementation. Andrew Hatherley is not an attorney and does not provide legal advice. Information provided is financial in nature. Advisory services offered through Hatherley Capital Management, LLC. Divorce financial analysis services offered through Wiser Divorce Solutions, an affiliated company.